Rome in the spring of 1873 wore its ancient beauty like a woman who had forgotten how to smile, all crumbling grandeur and golden light filtering through centuries of dust, and it was into this city of ghosts that Duke Sebastian Ashford had wandered, seeking some small respite from the grief that had become his constant companion, a weight he carried in his chest like stones pressing against his ribs. He moved through the Galleria Borghese with the mechanical precision of a man who no longer truly saw the world around him. His black mourning clothes, a stark contrast to the marble statues that lined the halls, their white forms catching the afternoon sun that slanted through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny spirits. 3 years had passed since Celeste's death, 3 years that felt both endless and impossibly brief, and Sebastian had worn his widow's black every single day, refusing invitations, refusing comfort, refusing to acknowledge that the world continued to turn, despite the fact that his had stopped entirely. He paused before a painting without intending to, his feet simply ceasing their movement as though his body recognized something his mind had not yet processed, and when his eyes focused on the canvas before him, the breath left his lungs in a rush that left him dizzy. The portrait showed a woman in simple merchant's clothing, her face turned partially into shadow, but the curve of her neck, the delicate line of her jaw, the way her dark hair caught the painted light, it was impossible, utterly impossible, and yet every fiber of his being screamed recognition. Celeste, his dead wife, captured in oil and canvas, alive in Rome when she should have been bones and dust in the Ashford family crypt. His hands trembled as he gripped the gallery railing, knuckles white, and he felt the familiar cocktail of emotions that had defined his existence rise up to choke him. Grief that she was gone, confusion that she could be here, rage at the impossibility of it all, and beneath everything else, a terrible, treacherous hope that perhaps death had not claimed her after all. The small brass placard beneath the portrait read, La Straniera, the stranger artist unknown. And Sebastian stared at those words until they blurred before his eyes, his brilliant mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities, through logic and madness. He remembered their wedding day with sudden, crystalline clarity, how he had watched her walk down the aisle toward him and felt something fierce and possessive ignite in his chest, how he had thought mine with every step she took, how even then his love had felt less like tenderness and more like hunger, less like devotion and more like desperate need. If this was truly Celeste, if she had somehow survived, if she had fled from him and built a life here in this eternal city, then she had committed the ultimate betrayal, had chosen to leave him when she had sworn before God and witnesses to remain. But if it was merely some woman who resembled his lost love, some cruel trick of genetics and coincidence, then he would find her anyway, would possess this echo of what he had lost, would make her his as Celeste had been his. Either way, the obsession that had defined his grief now found new purpose, sharp and clear and utterly consuming. He would find this woman, he would uncover the truth, and when he did, nothing in heaven or earth would keep her from him again. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1870, England wore its finest colours for the wedding of Lady Celeste Whitmore to Duke Sebastian Ashford, the ancient chapel at Ashford Manor, dressed in white roses and trailing ivy. Sunlight streaming through stained glass windows to paint the stone floors in jeweled patterns of crimson and sapphire and gold. And yet beneath all this carefully orchestrated beauty, beneath the rustle of silk gowns and the murmur of assembled nobility, Celeste felt only a terrible, gnawing dread that sat in her stomach like swallowed stones. The arrangement had been concluded 6 months prior in her father's study, Lord Whitmore's hands trembling slightly as he signed away his only daughter to settle debts that had accumulated through years of poor investments and excessive gambling. And Celeste had stood silent in the doorway, understanding with awful clarity that she was not a beloved child, but a commodity, a piece of flesh and lineage to be bartered for financial salvation. She had heard the whispers about Duke Ashford even before their first meeting, how he was brilliant but cold, wealthy beyond measure but utterly without warmth, how previous courtships had ended abruptly when young ladies found excuses to withdraw their interest, though no one spoke openly of why these well-bred girls had fled from such an advantageous match. Their first meeting had been in the drawing room of her family's London townhouse, Sebastian arriving with the precision of a military campaign, his dark eyes fixing upon her with an intensity that made her feel not admired but catalogued, assessed, claimed before a single word passed between them, and when he took her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, she had felt the possessive pressure of his fingers, the way he held on just a fraction too long, marking her as his before any vows were spoken. Now, walking down the aisle toward him on her father's arm, she saw that same intensity burning in Sebastian's gaze, saw the way he watched her approach as though she were prey, walking willingly into his carefully laid trap, and some part of her wanted to turn and flee, to gather her white silk skirts and run from this beautiful prison before its doors closed forever. But there was nowhere to run. Her father's debts, her family's honor, the weight of expectation and duty all formed chains more binding than any iron, and so she placed her trembling hand in Sebastian's and spoke the vows that would seal her fate. The wedding night arrived with the inevitability of winter, and in the vast master bedroom of Ashford Manor, Sebastian had taken her face between his hands, with surprising gentleness, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones as he whispered, "You are mine now, Celeste, wholly and completely mine. Body and soul and every breath you take belongs to me, and I will never, never let you go." She had felt ice flood her veins at those words, understanding too late that what she had mistaken for passionate devotion was something far darker, far more consuming. In the days that followed, small details accumulated like evidence at an inquest. Sebastian choosing which gowns she would wear each morning, his servants reporting her conversations and whereabouts, his insistence on reading her correspondence before it was sent, the way his jaw tightened when her lady's maid made her laugh, the cold fury in his eyes when any man looked at her with appreciation. This was not love, Celeste realized with growing horror. This was ownership, possession, the slow suffocation of a soul beneath the weight of another's obsession. Weeks passed, and life at Ashford Manor settled into a rhythm that resembled normalcy only to those who observed from a distance, while Celeste lived each day within the suffocating confines of what she had come to recognize as a gilded cage, beautiful in every material aspect, yet devastating to her spirit in ways she had never imagined possible. Sebastian lavished her with gifts that arrived with clockwork regularity, emeralds to match her eyes, sapphires because they reminded him of the gown she had worn at their engagement ball, ropes of pearls that felt like shackles around her throat, silk dresses in every imaginable color that he personally selected each morning, his fingers trailing possessively over the fabrics as he decided what she would wear, as though her body were merely another possession to be dressed and displayed according to his preferences. She could not take a walk in the gardens without a servant appearing moments later, ostensibly to offer assistance but clearly sent to observe and report back, could not spend an afternoon in the library without Sebastian appearing to ask what she was reading, his questions seeming innocent until she noticed how he would later check the books she had selected, as though her choice of literature might reveal some secret rebellion brewing in her heart. Her correspondence was monitored with meticulous care. Letters from childhood friends arrived, opened, their contents clearly read before being passed to her, and her own replies were reviewed by Sebastian before being sent, his explanations that he simply wished to ensure she was well represented in society, ringing hollow when she saw how he frowned at any expression of independent thought or feeling. The dinner party in late summer became a turning point in her understanding of just how complete his possession had become, when Lord Harrington, an elderly gentleman who had known her father, told an amusing anecdote about a mishap during a fox hunt, and Celeste had laughed genuinely for the first time in weeks, her amusement unguarded and natural, only to catch Sebastian's expression across the table, a flash of such cold fury that it stopped her breath, though he smiled and joined the laughter a moment later, as though nothing had occurred. That night, after the guests had departed and the house had fallen into silence, he came to her chambers and spoke in that terribly controlled voice he used when his rage was greatest, telling her that she was his wife, marked by his name and bound by sacred vows, spoken before God and witnesses, that every smile, every laugh, every moment of joy she experienced belonged to him and him alone, that she had no right to share her happiness with others, as though it were some common thing to be distributed freely. Celeste lay awake long after he left, understanding with perfect, terrible clarity that wealth meant nothing, that title and position were worthless, that she lived in a beautiful prison where the bars were made of obligation and obsession rather than iron, and that if she did not find some way to escape, Sebastian's love would consume her entirely until nothing remained of the woman she had been, until she became merely a reflection of his desires, a possession polished and perfect and utterly, devastatingly empty. Months later, as autumn painted the grounds of Ashford Manor in shades of amber and crimson, Celeste had undergone a transformation invisible to casual observation but profound in its essence, shifting from the frightened bride who had walked down the aisle in spring to a woman who understood with terrible clarity that she must either find a way to escape or lose herself entirely to Sebastian's consuming obsession. Mrs. Dawson, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Ashford family for 3 decades, had been the first to recognize the quiet desperation in the young Duchess's eyes, had seen how Celeste would stand at the windows overlooking the gardens with the expression of a caged bird studying the sky, and in small gestures of kindness, a cup of tea brought unbidden, a gentle word, when Sebastian's demands grew particularly suffocating, the old woman planted seeds of possibility that something different might exist beyond these walls. Dr. Hartley, the family physician, proved the second unexpected ally, a widower of 50 years, whose kind eyes had witnessed enough of human suffering to recognize a woman being slowly smothered beneath the weight of her husband's devotion. And during his regular visits to attend to minor ailments of the household staff, he began to observe the small signs that accumulated like evidence, how Celeste would flinch slightly when Sebastian entered a room unexpectedly, how her smiles never quite reached her eyes, how she had developed a persistent tremor in her hands that spoke of constant anxiety. The discovery that changed everything came on a grey October afternoon when Celeste, seeking a book in Sebastian's private study during one of his rare absences from the manor, found tucked in a drawer a collection of correspondence regarding his previous courtships, letters from families politely withdrawing their daughters from consideration, and beneath the official refusals, private investigator reports detailing how these young women had subsequently vanished from society. One married hastily to a merchant and sailed for America, another entered a convent in Scotland, a third simply disappeared with rumors she had died abroad, though no death certificate existed, and Celeste understood with ice flooding her veins that she was not the first woman to recognize the danger in Sebastian Ashford's and particular brand of love, merely the first who had not escaped before the cage door closed completely. That evening, her hands shaking as she poured tea in the drawing-room, she found herself alone with Mrs. Dawson and spoke with careful casualness about a story she had read of a woman who had fled a terrible situation, and the housekeeper's response, delivered in a low voice while arranging flowers, carried the weight of lived experience. My own daughter, God rest her, she escaped a husband who would have killed her with his jealousy 20 years past now, started anew in Bristol, under a different name, and sometimes, Your Grace, sometimes the only way to survive is to become someone new entirely. The seed of possibility took root in Celeste's mind with the ferocity of desperate hope, and she began her own careful preparations, taking small amounts of money from the household accounts that Sebastian would not notice, hiding pieces of jewelry in the lining of her winter cloak, studying the servants' schedules to understand the rhythms of the house, and all the while maintaining the perfect performance of dutiful wife, even as she planned her own death and resurrection, understanding that nothing less than her complete disappearance would free her from the man who had vowed never to let her go. Winter approached with the inevitability of fate, bringing shorter days and longer shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness of Celeste's circumstances, and during these cold months she cultivated her acquaintance with Dr. Hartley, with the careful patience of someone planting seeds in frozen ground, knowing that her very survival depended on the harvest. The physician visited Ashford Manor weekly to attend to the household, and Celeste ensured she was present for tea afterward, creating opportunities for conversation that began with innocuous topics, the weather, local affairs, books they had read, but gradually deepened into discussions of philosophy and ethics that allowed her to understand the man beneath the professional exterior. She learned that his wife had died 5 years prior of consumption, wasting away over months, while he stood helpless despite all his medical knowledge, and she could hear in his voice the terrible guilt of a healer who could not save the one person who mattered most, the unspoken belief that he had somehow failed in his fundamental duty. During one particularly intimate conversation in the library while Sebastian was away inspecting his northern properties, she posed a hypothetical question with her heart hammering against her ribs. What would a physician do if someone needed to disappear for their own survival, if remaining visible meant certain destruction? Doctor. Hartley had looked at her with those knowing eyes and asked quietly whether they were still speaking in hypotheticals, and in that moment Celeste understood she had found either her salvation or her doom. The plan crystallized over weeks of carefully coded conversations. Doctor. Hartley wrestling visibly with the conflict between his Hippocratic oath to do no harm and his growing understanding that helping Celeste vanish might be the greatest act of healing he could perform, that sometimes saving a life required methods no medical school taught. The turning point came on a January afternoon when Sebastian, in one of his possessive rages over some imagined slight, had gripped Celeste's arms with such force that bruises bloomed like dark flowers on her pale skin, and that evening she showed these marks to Dr. Hartley along with the lock that Sebastian had recently installed on the outside of her bedroom door, ostensibly to protect her but actually to control her movements, even while she slept. The physician's face had gone white with fury and recognition, and he spoke words that sealed their conspiracy. I have watched one woman I cared for die while I stood helpless. I will not watch another be destroyed when I have the power to prevent it. They settled on a plan both audacious and simple. Celeste would feign sudden illness. Dr. Hartley would administer a carefully measured combination of herbs that would slow her heart and breathing to imperceptible levels, creating the appearance of death that would fool even close examination. And Mrs. Dawson would arrange with a sympathetic undertaker to switch Celeste's body for that of an unclaimed pauper woman, smuggling the living Duchess out of Ashford Manor in the very coffin meant for her burial, while Sebastian mourned over a stranger's corpse. The execution of the plan began on a bitter February morning, when Celeste descended to breakfast with careful pallor painted on her face and complained of feeling unwell, a headache that pressed behind her eyes like iron bands, and Sebastian's immediate concern carried that terrible possessiveness she had come to know so intimately, his insistence that she return to bed. That Dr. Hartley be summoned at once, that nothing should threaten what belonged to him. Over the following 3 days, Celeste's feigned illness progressed with theatrical precision, orchestrated by Dr. Hartley's careful direction. She refused food, claimed dizziness, allowed her skin to take on a clammy quality, achieved through clever application of damp cloths when Sebastian was not watching, and the Duke's anxiety transformed into something approaching panic, for in his twisted understanding, she could not be permitted to die because death would steal her from him more completely than any earthly separation. On the 4th night, with storm winds howling against Ashford Manor's windows like the keening of spirits, Celeste drank the bitter draught that Dr. Hartley had prepared, a carefully measured combination of belladonna and other herbs that would slow her heart to nearly imperceptible beats and make her breathing so shallow that even a physician's examination would confirm death, and as the liquid burned down her throat, she felt her body begin to cool from within, her limbs growing heavy as lead, her consciousness retreating to a small flickering point deep inside her skull, while her external self became a convincing corpse. The awful performance that followed would haunt her in dreams. For years afterward she could hear everything but could not move, could not signal that she still lived, trapped in the prison of her own paralyzed flesh as Dr. Hartley pronounced her dead in a voice trembling with feigned shock. And then came Sebastian's response, a howl of rage and anguish that seemed torn from the depths of his soul, as he screamed that she could not leave him, that she had no right to escape him even through death, and the sounds of furniture being smashed and of priceless objects hurled against walls, of a man whose tenuous grip on sanity had finally shattered completely. Through her paralysis, Celeste heard him rage that he would follow her into death, that they would be together in the grave if not in life, heard him weeping over her body with terrible broken sobs, while whispering promises to never forget her, to never love again, to preserve her memory as a sacred shrine, and in those moments she understood with absolute certainty that her escape had been necessary, that this was not love, but a sickness that would have eventually consumed them both. The hasty funeral arrangements proceeded with unseemly speed, Sebastian insisting she be buried within 2 days, as though he could not bear to be parted from her body, even in death, and during the night before the funeral, Mrs. Dawson and a sympathetic undertaker, whom Dr. Hartley had bribed with a small fortune, executed the final deception, switching Celeste's still paralyzed form for the body of an unknown woman who had died alone in London's workhouse, and through it all Sebastian kept vigil beside what he believed was his wife's coffin, speaking to her in low, desperate tones about how she had been his entire world, how he would carry her in his heart until his own death came to reunite them, confirming in every whispered word the depths of an obsession that had masqueraded as devotion. Celeste woke to the rhythmic creaking of wooden wheels and the smell of hay and wool, her body aching as though she had been beaten, every muscle stiff and protesting as consciousness returned in slow, painful waves, and for a terrible moment she could not remember where she was or what had happened, until she opened her eyes to see the rough canvas covering of a cart above her and Mrs. Dawson's weathered face peering down with anxious relief, whispering, "Thank God, thank God. I feared the draught had been too strong." The journey to Dover unfolded in fragments of sensation rather than coherent memory, the bone-deep cold that no amount of rough wool blankets could dispel, the constant fear that Sebastian's men would overtake them at any moment, the guilt that gnawed at her heart for the pain she had caused, even as relief flooded through her at each mile that separated her from Ashford Manor, and through it all Mrs. Dawson sat beside her with a small leather bag containing the few pieces of jewellery Celeste had managed to hide, and enough coins to start a modest life somewhere far from England's shores. The crossing to France on a merchant vessel was accomplished in a blur of seasickness and terror. Celeste huddled below deck with her face hidden beneath a widow's veil, mourning in a strange and literal way for the death of Lady Celeste Ashford, even as she was simultaneously that very woman breathing and alive, and she found herself weeping not just from fear, but from a profound sense of loss for the life she might have had if Sebastian had been capable of love instead of possession, if her father had not sold her to settle his debts, if the world had been different in 1,000 small ways. In Paris, she became Catherine Moreau through the simple expedient of declaring it so, cutting her long dark hair short in a style that would have scandalized London society, dyeing what remained a lighter brown that changed the entire shape of her face, and she discovered that transformation was less about physical alteration than about the shedding of an entire identity, like a snake discarding old skin. She found work in a fabric shop owned by a widow who asked no questions about Catherine's past and seemed to understand that some women arrived in Paris fleeing rather than seeking, and the months that followed were marked by poverty of a kind Celeste had never imagined. Thin soups and hard bread, a single room barely large enough for a narrow bed, chilblains in winter, and the constant ache of labor in her hands, but also by a peace she had never known. In all her years of luxury, the simple freedom of walking down a street without being watched, of speaking to whom she pleased, of belonging to herself alone. Yet even in Paris she could not feel entirely safe, could not shake the fear that Sebastian would somehow discover the deception, that Dr. Hartley's careful falsifications would unravel, that she would wake one morning to find her husband standing over her with that terrible possessive smile, and so after 8 months of saving every spare sou, she boarded another ship bound for Italy, for Rome, for a city so distant from England that surely even Sebastian's long reach could not find her there. Weeks passed, then months, and Catherine saved every spare coin with the fierce determination of someone building not just a future, but a fortress against the past, until finally she had enough to board a ship bound for Rome, a city so distant from England that surely even Sebastian's obsessive reach could not extend across mountain and sea to find her there, and when she first glimpsed the ancient city rising golden in the Mediterranean sun, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since her wedding day. Rome in spring was a revelation of warm ochre stone and cypress trees, of fountains splashing in piazzas where artists sketched and lovers strolled, of churches whose bells marked hours with melodious insistence, of narrow streets that smelled of baking bread and sun-warmed stone, and the particular perfume of orange blossoms that drifted from hidden gardens, and Catherine understood immediately why people spoke of the Eternal City as a place of rebirth, for she felt herself shedding the last vestiges of Lady Celeste Ashford like a butterfly emerging from a confining chrysalis. She found work at a modest pension near the Campo de' Fiori, cleaning rooms and serving meals to the rotating cast of travellers who passed through, and though the labour was humble, and her hands grew rough from scrubbing floors and laundering linens. She discovered a profound satisfaction in honest work that asked nothing of her but her effort, that measured her worth in completed tasks rather than in how well she adorned a man's arm or reflected his status. In the evenings, when her work was finished, she would walk through the neighborhood and gradually became aware of a small artistic community that gathered in the cafes and studios clustered around the Via Margutta. Painters and sculptors, poets and musicians, people who had come to Rome seeking inspiration or escape, or simply a place where they could exist outside the rigid hierarchies of their homelands. And though she kept herself carefully apart at first, afraid of being known, afraid of being seen, she began to recognize familiar faces and exchange tentative greetings. It was Marco who first approached her directly, a struggling portrait artist with paint perpetually under his fingernails and a gentleness in his manner that was nothing like Sebastian's intensity, who stopped her one evening as she walked past his studio and said in Italian-accented English that he had been watching her, not with predatory interest, but with an artist's curiosity, for he saw something haunted in her eyes and in the way she held herself, something that spoke of profound sadness barely contained, and he asked if she would consider sitting for a portrait. Catherine's immediate response was terror to be captured in paint, felt like being trapped again, like being possessed and displayed, like giving someone power to define and own her image. But Marco seemed to sense her fear without understanding its source, and simply smiled, said there was no pressure, that the offer stood if she ever changed her mind, and something in his patient acceptance, his willingness to let her choose freely without manipulation or insistence, gradually wore away her resistance, until one afternoon she found herself climbing the stairs to his sun-filled studio and agreeing to sit for him. Wearing her simple working dress, her face partially turned into shadow, and the sessions became a form of meditation, hours of peaceful silence, broken only by the scratch of charcoal on canvas, and Marco's gentle requests to shift her position slightly, and he asked nothing about her past, seemed content to simply capture what he saw in the present moment. And in Rome, beneath Marco's respectful gaze and surrounded by the city's ancient beauty, Catherine began to heal and believed that perhaps she might truly be free, that the life she had built from nothing might actually be hers to keep. 6 months had passed since Lady Celeste Ashford's burial in the family crypt, and in that time Sebastian had descended into a grief so profound and so twisted that the servants at Ashford Manor whispered among themselves that the Duke had gone quite mad, for he kept his wife's chambers exactly as she had left them, her brushes still arranged on the vanity, with strands of her dark hair caught in the bristles, her gowns hanging in the wardrobe untouched, her favorite book still open on the bedside table to the page she had supposedly been reading before her sudden illness. And each day, without fail, he would spend hours in that preserved shrine, speaking to her portrait as though she could hear him, telling her about estate matters and political affairs, asking her opinion on decisions he must make, sometimes weeping, sometimes sitting in terrible silence. He had refused every social engagement since her death, declined his seat in Parliament, wore nothing but mourning black that made his already pale face appear ghostly, and he moved through the manor like a spectre himself, barely eating, sleeping in fitful fragments. His obsession with Celeste in death even more consuming than it had been in life, for at least when she lived he could possess her physically, could see her and touch her and know she was his, but now she existed only in memory and that precious painted likeness, and the loss had hollowed him into something barely human. Dr. Hartley, who visited occasionally under the pretense of checking on the Duke's health, watched this deterioration with a guilt that gnawed at his conscience like a persistent disease, wondering in his darkest moments whether they had been right to help Celeste escape, or whether they had simply traded her imprisonment for Sebastian's descent into madness. But then he would remember the bruises on her arms, the terror in her eyes, the lock on her bedroom door, and he would steel himself with the conviction that saving her life had been worth this consequence, though the conviction felt increasingly hollow as he witnessed Sebastian's unraveling. Sebastian's younger sister, Lady Margaret, travelled from her husband's estate in Yorkshire to plead with her brother to rejoin the world of the living, and she found him in Celeste's room, as always, sitting in the chair by the window where his wife had often read. and she begged him to consider that Celeste would not want him to waste his life in mourning, that he must honor her memory by living fully. But Sebastian turned to her with eyes so empty they frightened her, and said in a voice devoid of inflection, "I am dead as well, Margaret. Can you not see that? We are buried together, she and I, and there is no resurrection for either of us." And Margaret fled the manor in tears, writing to Dr. Hartley that her brother was beyond her reach. Yet even in his madness, Sebastian's obsessive nature found a new focus, for if he could not have Celeste herself, he would preserve her memory with fanatical perfection and commissioning investigations into her final days, demanding detailed accounts from every servant who had attended her, questioning Dr. Hartley repeatedly about the progression of her illness, seeking some meaning or pattern in her death that might make it bearable, some way to understand why she had been taken from him. And though he found nothing suspicious in the carefully constructed narrative of sudden illness and swift decline, his restless mind could not quite accept the randomness of it, could not reconcile himself to a world where something so precious could simply vanish without reason or warning. And so he continued to search for answers that did not exist. While in Rome, Catherine lived the free life he had never allowed her, and Dr. Hartley maintained his compassionate deception, and the ghost of Lady Celeste Ashford haunted Ashford Manor in ways both literal and metaphorical, a spectre of obsessive love that had consumed them both. 1 year had passed since Lady Celeste Ashford had been laid to rest in the family crypt, and in that time the woman who now called herself Catherine had blossomed in Rome's perpetual spring, like a plant finally given proper light and water after years in shadow, for she had found work teaching English to the children of prosperous merchants and minor nobility who wished their offspring to master the language of commerce and diplomacy, and she lived in a small sunny room on the 4th floor of a building near the Spanish Steps, where she could hear the fountain splashing day and night and watch the flower sellers arrange their blooms each morning in the piazza below. She had formed careful friendships with other women in the expatriate community, English and American ladies who had come to Rome seeking artistic inspiration or respite from constraining social expectations, and with local women as well. The wife of her landlord who taught her to make proper pasta, the seamstress in the shop below who altered Catherine's modest dresses and shared gossip over cups of strong coffee, and though Catherine still guarded the truth of her past with absolute vigilance, never speaking of her life before Paris, never mentioning a husband or a title or the cold grey stones of Ashford Manor, she felt increasingly safe in the warmth of these connections, increasingly convinced that her new life was solid and real and hers to keep. Marco had become her dearest friend in Rome. Though there was nothing romantic between them, he was too absorbed in his art and his quiet love for a baker's son, who sometimes modeled for him to see Catherine as anything but a kindred spirit, someone else carrying sadness like a familiar burden. But his friendship was precious to her precisely because it asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply existed in the comfortable space of shared silence and occasional conversation. The portrait he had painted of her, La Straniera, had taken months to complete because he worked on it between commissions, and when he finally showed her the finished canvas, she had stood before it, feeling strange and exposed and oddly moved, for he had somehow captured the essential truth of her, a woman suspended between shadow and light, and between past and present, neither wholly visible nor entirely hidden, beautiful in her melancholy, mysterious in her quietness, and she understood that he had seen her more clearly than she had seen herself. Marco had entered the portrait in a small gallery exhibition near the Via del Corso, and Catherine had attended the opening with a flutter of nervousness, quickly soothed by the anonymity of the crowd. For who among these Roman art lovers could possibly connect this simple English teacher in her plain grey dress to the aristocratic Lady Celeste, who had died across the sea in fog-bound England, and she had stood before her own image feeling peculiarly disconnected from it, as though the woman in the painting were someone she had known long ago rather than a reflection of herself. The painting had attracted attention from several collectors, including an English art dealer who specialized in contemporary Italian works and who had questioned Marco extensively about the subject, expressing particular interest in the quality of sadness the artist had captured, and Catherine had felt the first cold flutter of unease at the mention of English interest. But she had dismissed it quickly, reasoning that she was utterly transformed from the dark-haired duchess who had once graced London ballrooms. that even her own mother would struggle to recognize her now with her shorter, lighter hair and sun-touched skin, and the peace that had finally begun to settle in her eyes. And she returned to her small sunny room that evening, convinced that she was safe, that the past was truly buried, that Catherine Moreau had become as real and solid as the Roman stones beneath her feet. 3 years had passed since Lady Celeste Ashford's death, and Duke Sebastian Ashford stood in a sun-drenched gallery in Rome during the spring of 1873, his body rigid with shock as he stared at a portrait that should not exist, could not exist, yet hung before him with undeniable reality, a woman in simple merchant's clothing, her face partially shadowed by the angle of light the artist had captured, her hair lighter and shorter than he remembered, but the curve of her neck absolutely unmistakable. The way she held her head with that particular tilt of contemplation he had studied for endless hours during their brief marriage. And above all, those eyes, those haunted melancholic eyes that had looked at him with such carefully concealed fear, now rendered in oil paint with an expression he had never seen in life, something that looked almost like peace. His heart hammered against his ribs, with such violence he thought he might collapse there on the polished marble floor among the other gallery patrons who drifted past the painting, without recognition, without understanding that they were looking at a ghost, at a woman 3 years dead and buried in the Ashford family crypt. And Sebastian's mind raced through impossible explanations, coincidence, resemblance, his own madness finally consuming him completely, but he rejected each one with the certainty of a man who had memorized every detail of his wife's face and form, who had spent 1,000 hours studying her portrait at Ashford Manor, who knew beyond any shadow of doubt that this was Celeste, his Celeste, impossibly alive and living in Rome under God, knew what name and circumstances. He approached the gallery owner with barely contained urgency, demanding to know the artist, the subject, every detail of the painting's provenance, and the portly Italian gentleman could tell him only that the work was titled La Straniera. The Stranger, painted by a local artist named Marco Bellini, who specialized in portraits of the city's expatriate community, and that the subject's identity was unknown, anonymous, merely a woman who had sat for the artist some months ago. Sebastian's hands trembled as he gripped his walking stick, his mind simultaneously calculating and raging. For if this portrait was recent, then Celeste had been alive all this time, had faked her death with deliberate cruelty, had abandoned him and fled to Italy while he mourned her like a madman, and the betrayal of it burned through him with acid intensity, even as a terrible joy surged beneath the rage. Because she was alive, she existed somewhere in this ancient city, breathing and walking and living without him, which meant she could be found, could be reclaimed, could be made to answer for what she had done. He studied the painting with renewed intensity, noting the differences. The lighter hair suggested deliberate disguise. The humble clothing spoke of reduced circumstances, but that expression of peace, that softness in her features that had never existed when she was his wife, that subtle transformation suggested she was happy in her exile, content in her freedom, and the realization ignited his obsession with devastating force. Because if it was truly Celeste, then she had betrayed everything sacred between them and deserved his wrath. She deserved to be dragged back to England and made to remember her vows and her place. But if by some impossible chance this was merely a woman who resembled his dead wife so perfectly that even he could not tell the difference, then he must possess this echo of his lost love, must own this living reminder of what death had stolen from him. And either way, whether the woman in this portrait was truly Celeste or merely her uncanny double, Sebastian knew with absolute certainty that he would find her, would have her, would make her his once more. For obsession does not die simply because its object has supposedly perished, and the Duke of Ashford had learned long ago that what he wanted, he took, regardless of death or distance or any force on earth that might stand between him and his possession. Sebastian hired investigators that very afternoon, summoning to his hotel room a trio of men who specialized in locating missing persons and conducting discreet inquiries for wealthy clients throughout Europe, and he spared no expense in instructing them to find everything about the artist, Marco Bellini, and the woman who had sat for the portrait titled La Straniera, offering gold enough to purchase their absolute dedication and silence. for he would not have word spread through Rome's gossip channels that the Duke of Ashford was hunting for a woman who might be his supposedly dead wife. Within 2 days, the investigators returned with an address in Trastevere, where Marco Bellini kept his studio, and Sebastian presented himself there on a bright morning when the light slanted golden through the narrow streets, climbing 3 flights of worn stone steps to knock upon a paint-stained door that opened to reveal a young man with kind eyes and perpetually ink-stained fingers who looked at the well-dressed English duke with curious politeness and invited him inside to view his other works. Sebastian barely glanced at the canvases lining the walls, the portraits of merchants and their wives, the landscapes of the Roman countryside, the still lifes of fruit and flowers, for his entire focus narrowed to extracting information about the one portrait that mattered, and he asked with studied casualness about La Straniera, remarking that the subject had reminded him of someone he once knew, and wondering if the artist might share any details about the woman who had sat for him. Marco, innocent of any danger and proud of his work, spoke freely about his subject, an English teacher named Catherine Moreau, who had lived in Rome for nearly 2 years, a quiet woman with a melancholic air who taught the children of prosperous families and kept largely to herself, kind and gentle in her manner, someone who had initially refused to sit for the portrait out of a strange fear of being seen, but had eventually agreed and proved a patient and contemplative model, and he mentioned without hesitation that she lived in a pensione near the Spanish Steps, that she could often be seen in the early mornings, walking to the fountain there, or in the evenings returning from her lessons. Sebastian felt his heart constrict with a mixture of rage and triumph, so intense he thought he might strike the young artist simply for having looked at Celeste, for having captured her image, for having spent hours in her presence while Sebastian mourned an empty grave in England, but he maintained his composure and thanked Marco with cold courtesy before departing with the information burning in his mind like acid. The timeline matched perfectly. Catherine Moreau had arrived in Rome approximately when Celeste Ashford had died, the English Heritage explained. The teaching profession suited her education, and the melancholy air, the fear of being seen, all of it confirmed what Sebastian already knew with absolute certainty in the deepest chambers of his obsessed heart. That very afternoon, he positioned himself across the street from the pensione Marco had described, a building with faded yellow walls and green shutters near the Spanish Steps, and he waited with the patient intensity of a predator who knows his prey cannot escape. And when a woman emerged in the golden light of early evening, wearing a simple grey dress and carrying a canvas bag of books, her hair lighter than he remembered and cut shorter, but her movements utterly, unmistakably hers, Sebastian felt everything inside him go still and cold and certain, for there she was, his wife, his possession, his Celeste who had been stolen from him by her own cruel deception and who would now answer for 3 years of false mourning and genuine madness. 3 years during which he had preserved her memory like a saint's relic while she lived free and happy in Italian sunshine, teaching other people's children and sitting for portraits and existing in the world as though she had not destroyed him completely. He watched her walk toward the fountain, observed the way she moved with a lightness that had never existed at Ashford Manor, noticed how she smiled at a flower seller and stopped to admire the blooms, and the sight of her contentment, her peace, her freedom filled him with such volcanic fury that his hands shook where they gripped his walking stick. But beneath the rage ran a current of dark joy, because she was alive, she existed, she could be reclaimed and brought back to where she belonged, and Sebastian smiled his cruelest smile as he followed her through the winding Roman streets, keeping his distance, learning her patterns, planning his approach, for he would not simply confront her in public like some common jealous husband. No, he would choose his moment carefully, would corner her somewhere she could not easily flee, would make her understand that death itself had not been sufficient to free her from the vows she had made and the bond she had tried to sever. And as the Roman sun set in shades of gold and rose over the ancient city, Duke Sebastian Ashford stalked his supposedly dead wife through streets that had stood for millennia, a man consumed by obsession who had finally found the object of his twisted devotion and would not rest until he possessed her once more. Catherine had walked this route 100 times in the 2 years since she arrived in Rome, from her pensione near the Spanish Steps to the small piazza with its weathered fountain, where she sometimes stopped to rest before continuing to her afternoon lessons. But on this particular evening in spring, she felt the weight of invisible eyes upon her, a prickling awareness that lifted the small hairs at the nape of her neck and made her glance over her shoulder more than once, as she navigated the narrow streets, where shadows pooled between ancient buildings and the golden light slanted at severe angles. She told herself it was merely the lingering unease from seeing her portrait displayed in the gallery, the irrational fear that being captured in paint had somehow made her visible again to those she had fled. But when she reached the fountain and turned to dip her fingers in the cool water, she saw him standing 30 paces away, perfectly still among the moving crowd, his dark figure as immovable as the stone statues that adorned the piazza. And for one terrible suspended moment, she thought her mind had conjured him from her nightmares until his eyes met hers with such intensity that she knew beyond any doubt that Sebastian Ashford, Duke of Ashford, her husband who should have believed her dead these 3 years, stood before her in the flesh. The recognition crashed over her like a physical blow, and she staggered backward, her hand gripping the fountain's edge for support, and she watched with mounting horror as he began to move toward her, with the slow, deliberate approach of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere to run, his expression a terrible mixture of triumph and rage that she remembered from their marriage, that look he wore when someone dared to defy his will. "Hello, wife," he said when he stood close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes that had not been there before, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne, and his voice was cold and smooth as polished marble, each word precisely enunciated as though he were discussing the weather rather than addressing a woman who had risen from the grave. Catherine's first instinct was denial. She opened her mouth to claim he was mistaken, that she was Catherine Moreau and knew no duke, but the lie died on her lips, because what use was pretense when he stood before her with such absolute certainty, and instead she did the only thing her panicked mind could conceive, and she ran, bolting from the fountain and plunging into the maze of narrow streets that wound through Trastevere, her breath coming in ragged gasps as her feet pounded over ancient cobblestones. She could hear him behind her, his longer stride eating the distance she tried to create, and she darted left into an alley, and then right through a passage so narrow her shoulders nearly brushed the walls, emerging into a small courtyard attached to a church, where late afternoon shadows provided illusory shelter. But when she spun around seeking an exit, she found him blocking the only way out, his chest barely rising with exertion while she gulped air like a drowning woman. "Did you truly think you could run from me, Celeste?" he asked, advancing slowly as she backed toward the church wall, and the use of her true name felt like chains wrapping around her limbs. "I had to," she whispered, and then louder, desperate. "I had to escape, Sebastian. You must understand. I could not live that way. I could not." But he cut her off with a sharp gesture. "You are mine," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his voice which made it all the more terrifying. "You are my wife, bound by sacred vows before God and man, and death itself cannot change that fundamental truth. So, whatever game you have been playing here in Rome, whatever life you thought you could build in my absence, it ends now." She tried to appeal to any humanity that might still exist beneath his obsession, tried to explain through her tears that she had been suffocating, that his love had felt like drowning, and that she needed freedom to be a whole person, but he listened with the patient expression of someone indulging a child's tantrum before responding with devastating finality. "I love you enough to forgive even this betrayal, Celeste, this elaborate deception, this mockery you have made of my grief, and you will come home with me to England where you belong, where you will resume your place as Duchess of Ashford, and we will never speak of this unfortunate episode again." Sebastian secured a palazzo on the Via del Corso within hours of their confrontation, a grand residence with marble floors and frescoed ceilings that he rented at an extravagant price for immediate occupancy, and he installed Catherine there with guards posted at every exit, men whose salaries ensured their loyalty and discretion, transforming the beautiful Roman building into a prison as effective as any dungeon despite its gilded splendor. All the freedom she had built over 3 careful years evaporated in a single afternoon, her sunny room near the Spanish Steps abandoned, along with the books she used for teaching, the few simple dresses she owned, the small collection of sketches Marco had given her, everything that constituted her life as Catherine Moreau left behind as thoroughly as if she had died again. Sebastian announced his intention to return to England within the week, speaking of ship passages already booked and arrangements already made with the certainty of a man who had never once considered that his will might be defied. And Catherine felt despair settle over her like a heavy cloak, but beneath the despair burned something new, something that had not existed in the frightened bride who had fled England 3 years prior, for she had tasted freedom and built a life through her own efforts, and learned that she possessed strength she had never suspected. She was not the same woman who had trembled at Sebastian's slightest frown, and though she found herself trapped again, some essential core of her refused to break. Marco discovered her disappearance when she failed to appear for her afternoon lessons, and through the network of servants and shopkeepers who formed Rome's invisible web of gossip, he learned of an English duke who had appeared at the pensione, demanding to see Catherine Moreau and claiming she was his wife risen from the dead, and Marco presented himself at the palazzo's gates with the righteous fury of a man who had counted Catherine among his dearest friends and would not see her imprisoned without protest. Sebastian received him in a drawing room hung with heavy damask curtains, and when Marco demanded Catherine's release and spoke of justice and freedom, Sebastian's response was cold and final. This was a marital matter between husband and wife, the private business of an English peer reclaiming what belonged to him, and Marco had no standing whatsoever to interfere in affairs that concerned him not at all. The guards allowed Marco one brief supervised visit with Catherine, during which she begged him through her tears not to intervene further, not to risk Sebastian's wrath, for she had seen what her husband did to those who threatened his possession of her. But Marco left the palazzo and immediately alerted the small community of English and American expatriates who had befriended Catherine, and they began to plot what assistance they might offer, though none knew quite how to oppose a duke's legal rights over his wife. Meanwhile, in the palazzo's beautiful rooms, Catherine and Sebastian engaged in terrible, honest conversations that stripped away the polite pretenses of their marriage, and she asked him the question that had haunted her throughout their union. Why could he not simply let her go, release her to live her own life, find happiness with someone who wanted his particular brand of devotion? His answer came one evening as they sat in the library, separated by 10 feet of Persian carpet but bound by invisible chains, and he said with devastating simplicity, "Without you, I am nothing. Celeste, you gave my life meaning and purpose. You made me feel something beyond the emptiness that has consumed me since childhood, and I would rather see you miserable at my side than happy beyond my reach. For at least in your presence I exist as something more than a hollow shell performing the duties expected of my title." The crisis came on the 4th night of Catherine's captivity in the palazzo, when Sebastian appeared at the door of the drawing room where she sat reading by lamplight, and she saw immediately that something had shifted in him, for his carefully maintained composure had cracked like fine porcelain, subjected to too much pressure, his cravat loosened, and his dark hair disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and he carried a bottle of wine from which he had clearly been drinking, though he was not precisely drunk, but rather existed in that dangerous state where alcohol strips away the careful masks people wear and leaves only raw truth exposed. He sat heavily in the chair across from her, without invitation, and said without preamble, "You asked me why I cannot let you go, and I have been thinking on this question for days, and I realize you deserve an answer, though you will not like what you hear." And Catherine set aside her book and waited with held breath for whatever revelation was coming. Sebastian began to speak then of his childhood, in sentences that came haltingly at first, but gained momentum like a carriage rolling downhill, describing the cold marble halls of his family's estate, where love was never mentioned and duty was the only virtue that mattered, where his father, the old duke, had ruled with iron discipline and viewed any display of emotion as weakness, to be beaten out of a son who must someday command respect through fear and control. He told her of being 6 years old and crying over a dead puppy, only to have his father lock him in a cellar for 3 days, to teach him that sentiment was for women and weaklings, of being 10 and daring to speak up for a servant. His father wished to dismiss unjustly, and receiving such a thrashing that he could not sit for a week, of learning through 1,000 such lessons that to care for anything was to invite pain, and that safety lay only in dominating completely whatever one wished to keep. His voice grew quieter as he described his first love when he was 19. A merchant's daughter with kind eyes who had laughed at his attempts at poetry and made him feel for the first time that he might be something other than the cold creature his father had molded. But when his father discovered the attachment, he had forbidden it absolutely, and when Sebastian defied him and continued to court her in secret, the old duke had the girl's father's business destroyed through financial manipulation until the family was ruined and forced to leave the country, and Sebastian never saw her again. "My father beat me that night," Sebastian said, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Catherine's shoulder as though he could not bear to meet her gaze. "Beat me until I could scarcely stand, and told me that this was what came of caring, that anything I loved could be taken from me and used as a weapon, and the only way to prevent loss was to possess so completely that nothing and no one could ever take what was mine. And I learned that lesson well, Celeste, perhaps too well." He looked at her then with eyes that held such anguish that she felt her heart constrict despite everything he had done to her, and he continued in a voice barely above a whisper, "I love you so deeply that losing you would destroy me, and so in my twisted logic I believe that you must never be allowed to leave. For if you are always within my grasp, then I am safe from the terrible pain of loss, but I am beginning to understand that I have already lost you through the very means I used to try to keep you." Catherine felt tears slip down her cheeks as she looked at this broken man who had imprisoned her, and she recognized for the first time the damaged boy beneath the monster's mask, and pity rose in her throat like bile. But pity alone was not enough to make her sacrifice herself upon the altar of his healing. She leaned forward and said, with gentle firmness that cost her more than he would ever know, "Sebastian, your pain is real, and I am sorry for what was done to you. Truly I am, but your suffering does not entitle you to imprison me. Your father's cruelty does not give you the right to be cruel in turn, and love that requires cages is not love at all, but merely possession wearing love's name." So, Dr. Hartley arrived in Rome on a grey morning when autumn rains had finally reached the Eternal City, and he came to the Palazzo's gates requesting audience with the Duke of Ashford on a matter of utmost urgency, his travelling clothes dusty and his face haggard from days of difficult journey, for he had followed Sebastian across Europe, driven by a guilt that had grown unbearable in the months since he had watched the Duke descend into madness following Celeste's supposed death. Sebastian received him in the same drawing. Dr. Hartley arrived in Rome on a grey morning when autumn rain fell upon the ancient stones and turned the Tiber the colour of old bronze, and he came carrying the weight of 3 years' guilt like a physical burden upon his shoulders, for he had enabled Celeste's escape and felt responsible for the chain of events that followed, the deception that had set both wife and husband upon their separate paths of suffering and transformation. He presented himself at the Palazzo, where Sebastian held Catherine captive, and requested an audience with the Duke, but Sebastian refused him coldly, still harbouring resentment toward the physician who had pronounced his wife dead and mourned with him over a coffin that held nothing but weighted stones and broken dreams, though Sebastian did not yet know the full extent of Dr. Hartley's complicity in that terrible deception. It was Catherine who insisted upon seeing the doctor when she learned of his presence in Rome, and the guards reluctantly permitted him a brief supervised visit in the Palazzo's formal receiving room, where frescoed angels looked down upon their mortal struggles with painted indifference. Doctor? Hartley looked older than Catherine remembered, his hair gone completely white and new lines carved deep around his mouth and eyes, and when he took her hands in his she felt them trembling with emotion he could barely contain. "I have been consumed by guilt," he confessed in a voice rough with remorse, "watching what my actions wrought, seeing the Duke descend into madness while you remained lost to me, not knowing if you were safe or happy or even alive, and I have questioned every day whether I did right in helping you escape, or whether I simply traded one form of suffering for another." Catherine reassured him that he had saved her life in the truest sense, that the years of freedom she had known in Rome were worth any price she might now pay. "But Doctor..." Hartley shook his head and said he had not come merely to confess his guilt, but to offer something that might yet resolve this terrible impasse. He revealed then that Sebastian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, lay dying at Ashford Manor and had been asking for her son with increasing desperation, and Dr. Hartley believed this might be the key to reaching whatever humanity remained buried beneath Sebastian's obsession, for the Dowager was the one person whose opinion the Duke had ever truly valued, the one voice that might penetrate the armor of possession and control he had constructed around his damaged heart. Catherine saw immediately the possibility in this revelation, though she feared it might be false hope, another door that would close in her face, but she agreed to approach Sebastian with the proposal if Dr. Hartley would support her in this gambit. That evening, Catherine requested an audience with her captor husband and told him that Dr. Hartley had come with news of his mother's illness, and she watched something crack in Sebastian's careful composure at the mention of the woman who had given him what little tenderness his childhood had contained. He wanted to dismiss the news as manipulation, another attempt to escape his grasp, but Catherine saw the fear in his eyes, the ancient fear of a boy who had already lost too much, and she pressed her advantage with careful gentleness. "I will return to England with you willingly, if you will make me one promise," she said, her voice steady though her heart raced with desperate hope. "Grant me an audience with your mother. Let her hear both our stories, and if she believes I should be released, you will consider her judgment seriously, not as a command you must obey, but as counsel you might weigh." Sebastian refused initially, his pride and possessiveness warring against the filial duty that ran deep, despite all his damage, but the mention of his mother had opened something in him that could not easily be closed again, and after hours of terrible silence, he agreed to her bargain with one amendment. They would travel to England together and see his mother, and afterward he would grant Catherine the opportunity to state her case fully, and if his mother agreed that Catherine should be freed, he would not merely consider it but would genuinely struggle to honor her wisdom, though he could not promise what conclusion that struggle might reach. The voyage back to England stretched across 3 weeks of grey Atlantic waters and skies that seemed to mirror the uncertain territory. Catherine and Sebastian now navigated between them, for they travelled as neither quite husband and wife nor entirely strangers, but something more complex and painful. Two people bound by history and law, yet separated by an abyss of hurt that might never be fully bridged. Sebastian had arranged separate cabins as promised, a concession Catherine recognized as significant given his previous need to control her every movement, and they met for meals in the ship's dining salon, where other passengers provided a buffer of normalcy, and the rituals of formal dinner conversation prevented the most dangerous intimacies. Yet there were moments when the careful distance between them collapsed like a wave against the ship's hull, unexpected and overwhelming, such as the afternoon when Sebastian took ill from the rolling seas, and Catherine found herself at his cabin door with ginger tea and cool cloths, tending him with the same automatic compassion she would offer any suffering creature, despite the voice in her head that whispered he deserved no kindness from her hands. He looked up at her through fever-bright eyes as she pressed the cloth to his forehead and said hoarsely, "You need not do this. I have treated you abominably." And she replied simply, "I am not cruel, Sebastian, I never was, and I will not become so now merely because you gave me cause." They began to speak more honestly during those long days at sea than they ever had during their brief marriage. Strange, stilted conversations that happened during promenades on deck or in the ship's library, where other passengers nodded politely and moved away, giving the obviously troubled couple their privacy. Catherine learned things about Sebastian she had never known, details of his childhood that filled in the terrible picture he had begun to sketch in Rome. And though understanding did not excuse his actions, it did provide context that made him seem less monster and more damaged man, which was somehow both better and worse. There was the evening when a drunk passenger made inappropriate advances toward Catherine in a dim corridor, and Sebastian appeared from nowhere, with cold fury in his eyes, positioning himself between her and the threat with such protective instinct that the drunk retreated quickly. And Catherine found herself thanking him with genuine gratitude, even as she recognized the irony of being protected by the very man she needed protection from. One night they stood together at the ship's railing, watching moonlight silver the dark waters, and Sebastian asked in a voice so quiet she almost could not hear it over the wind, "Did you ever love me, even a little, or was it always only fear and duty?" "How?" Catherine considered lying, considered offering him some small comfort, but she had learned in Rome that truth was the only currency worth trading, and so she answered with careful honesty, "I wanted to love you, Sebastian, I truly did, for you were handsome and powerful, and I believed that perhaps in time affection might grow as they say it does in arranged marriages. But you never gave me room to discover what I might have felt, because you filled every space with your own need and possession, and love cannot grow in soil where there is no air to breathe." She saw him flinch, as though she had struck him, saw his hands tighten on the railing until his knuckles went white, but he did not rage or argue, only nodded slowly and said, "I understand." And they stood in silence, watching the moon's path across the water until the cold drove them inside to their separate cabins and separate beds. Catherine lay awake that night in her narrow bunk, feeling the ship roll beneath her and wondering if Sebastian too lay sleepless in his own darkness. And she thought about the question that haunted her increasingly. Could someone so fundamentally damaged ever truly change? And did she owe him anything beyond basic human compassion? And what did it mean that despite everything he had done to her, she still felt something when she looked at him that was not quite pity, but not quite indifference either? Her conclusion, reached somewhere in the small hours before dawn, was that she owed him truth and compassion as she would owe any human being. But she did not owe him her life or her freedom or her future, and whatever happened when they reached England and stood before his dying mother, Catherine would not sacrifice herself, even if it meant watching him break completely, for she had died once already to escape this cage, and she would not climb willingly back inside, no matter how gilded its bars or how pitiable its keeper. They arrived at Ashford Manor in autumn, when the trees surrounding the estate had turned to copper and gold, and the sight of those familiar grounds struck Catherine with unexpected force, for this was where her gilded cage had first closed around her, and where she had lived in mounting terror until she had been desperate enough to orchestrate her own death. And now she returned willingly but warily, tethered to Sebastian by the fragile bargain they had struck aboard the ship, and by the dying woman who waited within those ancient stone walls. The Dowager Duchess Marguerite Ashford lay in her chambers on the second floor, where afternoon light filtered through leaded windows and fell across her diminished form like benediction, and though her body had been ravaged by the wasting illness that consumed her from within, her eyes remained fierce and intelligent, missing nothing as Sebastian and Catherine entered together and stood before her like supplicants awaiting judgment. She looked first at her son, taking in the changes 3 years of grief and obsession had carved into his features, the new hardness around his mouth, and the haunted quality in his eyes that spoke of suffering he had both endured and inflicted. And then her gaze shifted to the woman she had believed dead and buried, and Catherine saw immediate recognition flash across the dowager's face, followed by something that looked almost like relief. The old woman dismissed Sebastian with a wave of her frail hand, and commanded, in a voice still capable of authority despite her weakness, "Leave us. I would speak with your wife alone." And though Sebastian hesitated, torn between his need to control every situation and his ingrained deference to his mother, he ultimately obeyed and retreated to wait in the corridor beyond, closing the door softly behind him. Catherine stood frozen until the dowager gestured to a chair beside the bed and said with unexpected gentleness, "Come closer, child. I am not yet so diminished that I cannot see the fear in your eyes, and you need not be afraid of me, for I know already what you are and what my son has done." Catherine approached slowly and sat as bidden, and the dowager reached out with a hand that trembled slightly and took Catherine's fingers in her own cool grasp, and there was such sorrow in the old woman's face that Catherine felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. The dowager spoke then of things Catherine had never known, revealing how Sebastian's father, the late Duke, had been a man of cruel discipline, who believed that sentiment was weakness, and that his heir must be forged like steel through systematic hardship, and she confessed with tears gathering in her faded eyes that she had tried to protect her son but had failed, had watched helplessly as the sensitive boy he had been was slowly destroyed and rebuilt into something harder and more dangerous. She told Catherine of Sebastian's childhood, how he had loved poetry and music until his father beat such softness out of him, how he had cried over injured birds until he learned that tears earned only contempt, how he had gradually learned to hide his tender heart beneath layers of control and possession, because vulnerability had always been punished and strength rewarded only when it manifested as dominance. The dowager apologized to Catherine for not preventing the marriage, for knowing her son was too damaged to be anyone's husband, but allowing family obligation and social pressure to override her maternal instinct that this union would bring only suffering, and Catherine found herself weeping quietly as she listened to this dying woman's confession and regret. But then the dowager's tone shifted, and she squeezed Catherine's hand with surprising strength and said, "You were right to leave him, right to choose life over the slow death he would have given you. And I will not ask you to sacrifice yourself upon the altar of his brokenness, but I would ask something else of you before I die." Catherine waited, hardly breathing, and the dowager continued, "Help him understand what love truly is, not by staying but by setting him free. For love that imprisons is not love at all, but only fear wearing love's mask. And until he learns this truth, he will never heal and will remain forever the broken thing his father made him." Catherine struggled to comprehend what the dowager asked of her, how she could possibly teach Sebastian anything when he had never listened to her before. But the old woman smiled sadly and said, "He is different now. You must have seen it during your journey together, the cracks appearing in the armor he constructed, and it is through those cracks that truth might finally penetrate if delivered with the right voice at the right moment, and that moment is nearly upon us." The dowager summoned Sebastian back into the chamber with a gesture that brooked no refusal, and when he entered and saw Catherine's tear-stained face and his mother's expression of terrible determination, he seemed to understand instinctively that something momentous was about to occur, something that would reshape the landscape of his existence in ways he could not yet comprehend. The old woman gestured for him to sit on the opposite side of her bed from Catherine, and when both were positioned before her like petitioners awaiting a sovereign's decree, she drew a labored breath and spoke with the full weight of her remaining authority, declaring that she would not close her eyes in final sleep until Sebastian made a sacred promise to grant Catherine her complete and unconditional freedom, releasing her from their marriage bonds and allowing her to live her life without interference or pursuit or any further claim upon her person or her future. Sebastian's face went pale as marble, and he began to protest, to argue that the law bound them regardless of personal wishes, that marriage vows spoken before God could not be so easily dissolved. But his mother silenced him with a raised hand and a look of such profound disappointment that he fell silent as though struck. The dowager told him then what Catherine suspected he had never truly heard or allowed himself to understand, that he had become precisely what his father had been, a man who used control to mask the terror of vulnerability, who confused possession with love because he had never been taught the difference, who imprisoned others rather than risk the uncertainty of trust and mutual choice. She asked him the question that cut to the heart of everything, her voice quiet but relentless as she said, "Do you love her, Sebastian? Truly love her as a person with her own soul and will and dreams? Or do you merely love the idea of owning her, of having something beautiful and precious that belongs only to you?" Sebastian's composure shattered like glass struck by stone, and Catherine watched with mingled pity and sorrow as 3 years of grief and rage and obsessive need cracked open to reveal the terrified boy still cowering beneath the hardened man, and he wept as she had never seen him weep, great shuddering sobs that shook his entire frame, while he pressed his hands to his face as though to hold himself together against forces that would tear him apart. He confessed through his tears that he did not know how to love any other way, that the thought of being alone again filled him with such existential dread that he would rather die than face it, that without her he feared he was nothing at all, just an empty title and an empty house and an empty heart that had never learned to sustain itself without external validation. Catherine felt her own tears spill over, but she kept her voice steady as she said with gentle firmness, "You are not nothing, Sebastian. You never were. But I cannot be your reason for existence. I cannot sacrifice my life to fill the void inside you. You must find within yourself the worth and purpose that no other person can provide." The dowager reached out with both trembling hands and took one hand from each of them, joining them together in her frail grasp, and she said to her son with infinite sadness and infinite love, "Let her go, my darling boy. Let her go freely and completely. Prove to yourself, and to her, and to me, that you are capable of the selfless love you claim to feel rather than the selfish obsession that has driven you thus far, for only in releasing her can you hope to find any redemption or peace." Sebastian looked at Catherine across his mother's bed, and she saw in his eyes the terrible war being waged between everything he had been taught to be and everything he might yet become, and finally, slowly, with the expression of a man stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness, he nodded and whispered, "I will let you go. I promise. I will not pursue you or seek you or make any claim upon you ever again." And with those words, something fundamental shifted in the air between them, as though chains that had bound them both suddenly fell away into dust. 5 years passed like water flowing through open fingers, carrying away the sharp edges of the past until what remained were smooth stones of memory that could be held without pain. And in the spring of 1878, in a sun-filled studio overlooking the terracotta rooftops of Florence, a woman who had been called Celeste and then Catherine, and was now known simply as Elise, stood before an easel, teaching a circle of young women the subtle art of capturing light and shadow on canvas, and the sound of their laughter filled the room like music. And she was happy in a way she had once believed impossible, wholly and completely herself, without needing to hide or diminish or apologize for the space she occupied in the world. The Morning Post brought letters as it always did, correspondence from friends scattered across Italy and France, invitations to exhibitions and salons, and among them a cream envelope bearing an English postmark, and handwriting she recognized despite the years that had passed, and she opened it with steady hands and no fear, for she had learned that the past could no longer reach out and reclaim her unless she allowed it. The Duke of Ashford wrote with careful formality that he had recently acquired a collection of botanical sketches from the East Indies and thought she might enjoy viewing the detailed illustrations of exotic flora, and that he would be honored to send them if she wished, that he asked nothing in return and hoped only that she was well and at peace. And it was the 10th such letter in 5 years, each one respectful and distant, each one acknowledging her complete freedom, some revealing in their careful words his slow and painful growth toward something resembling health. She wrote back as she always did, briefly and politely, thanking him for his thoughtfulness, declining the offer with gentle courtesy, wishing him continued strength in the charitable works he had mentioned in previous letters, and she signed it simply with her chosen name, no longer bearing his or any other man's title, and as she sealed the envelope, she felt nothing but a quiet satisfaction that they had both survived the destruction of what they had been and found paths toward something better. In England, Sebastian Ashford walked the grounds of a school he had founded for boys from difficult homes, boys whose fathers were cruel or absent, boys who needed to learn that strength could manifest as kindness and that control over others was the weakest form of power. And though he remained unmarked by new love and perhaps always would be, he had discovered purpose in healing the wounds in others that mirrored his own, and when he thought of Celeste now it was with gratitude rather than possession, thankful that she had loved herself enough to escape him and had possessed the courage to show him the monster he had become. Dear listener, sometimes the greatest act of love is release, the willingness to open your hands and let go of what you thought you could not live without, to trust that both you and the one you release will survive the separation and perhaps even flourish in ways that imprisonment would have forever prevented. In both the holding on and the letting go, in both the bonds we form and the freedom we grant, may you find the wisdom to know which serves love and which serves only the fear of being alone with yourself, and may you rest peacefully in the knowledge that you are enough, wholly and completely enough, all by yourself, without needing to possess another soul to prove your worth or fill the emptiness inside you that only you can heal. This has been a story from Evermore Tales, where every tale teaches us something about the human heart, and if this story has touched you, if it has reminded you of your own strength or your own capacity for growth beyond the patterns that shaped you, then subscribe to hear more stories of love and loss and the courage to choose freedom over familiar chains, for there are countless tales yet to be told, and each one holds a mirror to some truth about who we are and who we might yet become.